Well, what a flop. The great sexual assault and sexual harassment epidemic on Australian university campuses is a myth. But like all good myths cooked up by zealous advocates, don't expect this one to go away anytime soon. As predicted here on this channel, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. It was as though all the articles had been written before the report had even been released. Because if you'd checked the report, you couldn't possibly say things like damning figures if you'd actually looked at them, or that half of all students had been harassed in 2016 if you'd bothered to check what constitutes harassment in this survey. But that assumes that these news organisations actually want to find anything other than what they've already decided they were going to find in the first place. Now, the report itself is 264 pages long, so I'm not going to cover everything in it, but let's just get some basics out of the way before we get to the all-important numbers. Survey invitations were sent out to 320,000 students, so that's almost a quarter of the 1.3 million students at university in Australia. Out of that, they received almost 31,000 responses, which was an overall response rate of 9.7%. Now, a lot of people freaked out about that, but it's not unusual for a voluntary survey of this type to get a low response rate. It's a little lower than what the survey designers expected. They thought they'd get a response rate between 10 to 15%. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about what is an appropriate sample size. We have only 31,000 survey responses, or just 2.4% of the total population of students. How can that be an accurate representation? Well, actually, that's plenty, and you can check this out for yourself using any online sample size calculator. Even if we use strict assumptions like a 99% confidence interval and 1% margin of error for 1.3 million students, you'd only need a sample of a little less than 16,500, and this survey had almost twice that amount. So sample size is not a problem here. The real question is it a representative sample? If only 1 in 10 students responded to the survey, then it suggests an element of self-selection, or said another way, people who already had an interest in this topic or may have experienced sexual harassment or assault might be more inclined to fill out the survey. And they admit as much in the report. The survey data has been derived from a sample of the target population who were motivated to respond and who made an autonomous decision to do so. It may not necessarily be representative of the entire university student population. And as I mentioned earlier, having experienced harassment or assault could make you more or less likely to fill out the survey. So they did try to assess whether there was response bias by looking at how likely you were to respond to the survey if you had either experienced or witnessed sexual harassment or assault. And they found that they did find such a biased response for men, but not for women. Now, that's not an exhaustive method for detecting response bias. You could answer the survey out of interest without having experienced assault or witnessed harassment. So the fact that they did find some response bias, and given the self-selected nature of the survey, that should be kept in mind when looking at the results. So to the numbers. Firstly, sexual harassment. Key findings. 1 in 5, 21% of students, was sexually harassed in one of the following university settings in 2016. On campus, at an off-campus event organised by or endorsed by the university, at university employment, or for technology-based harassment where some or all of the perpetrators were students, teachers or other people associated with the university. And if you include travel to and from university, that number becomes 1 in 4. So here's the first graph, and you can see blue is sexually harassed anywhere, orange is at university and includes travel to and from university, which I don't think you should include. Remember, excluding the travel, it's 21%. So I'm going to ignore the blue because this is about universities. So almost 1 in 3 women experience sexual harassment at university, including travel, and about 1 in 6 males. If you take out the travel component, the harassment of women drops to 25%, or 1 in 4, and men drop slightly to 15%, or not quite 1 in 7. And the most common type of sexual harassment at university in 2016, staring or leering, 14%, followed by sexually suggestive comments or jokes, 11%, and intrusive questions about an individual's private life or physical appearance, 9%. And all those figures were higher for women. But away from the numbers, let's have a look at what's considered in this survey to constitute sexual harassment. Inappropriate staring or leering that made you feel intimidated. Well, intimidation is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? Or is it just that the person looking at you is not the type of person you want looking at you. Sexually suggestive comments or jokes that made you feel offended. Again, feeling offended, which is completely subjective. And did you just overhear the joke or comment, or was it directed at you? Intrusive questions about your private life or physical appearance that made you feel offended. So do you have a boyfriend an offensive question? I suspect for some snowflakes it is. How about, did you get a haircut? Again, this is completely subjective, but those are the top 3 categories, especially for women, for whom they account for 70% of the most recent incidents of sexual harassment over the 2015-2016 period. I was initially confused by this chart as to why they decided to combine 2015 and 2016, but which I later found out is supposed to represent the most recent incident of sexual harassment. Now, some people contacted me saying, look, men are more likely to be subject to certain types of harassment. For example, intrusive questions, 19% compared to women, 12%. But you have to remember, less than half the number of men reported harassment. So 19% of 2,292 men that reported harassment equals 435, whereas 12% of 4,995 women equals 599. But it appears students aren't that bothered by this so-called sexual harassment because 94% of students didn't report it, and the number one reason why they didn't report it, 68% said they didn't think it was serious enough, and 53% said, I did not think I needed help. Obviously, the percentages sum to more than 100% because you can nominate more than one answer. So I submit to you that most students aren't that bothered by someone staring at them or hearing a joke, even if they find it offensive. So can we really call it sexual harassment? Now, I know exactly what the response from fainting couch feminists will be. We're socialized into accepting this as normal behavior, especially the women. It's a form of internalized misogyny, don't you know? Well, I'm sorry, but perhaps most women aren't as fragile as you would like them to be. Now let's turn to sexual assault, and we learned that 6.9% of students experienced sexual assault over the 2015-2016 period, but only 1.6% occurred at university, which remember includes travelling to and from university. So that statistic there alone should debunk this whole idea that universities are less safe than elsewhere. More than 3/4 of sexual assault experiences by students happened in places other than the university. And remember, this is over 2 years, so the actual rate is 0.8% for a 12-month period, with women 3 times more likely than men to be sexually assaulted. Factor in also that 15% of sexual assaults occurred on public transport to and from university, so now you're down to 0.7% at university. Then, of course, there is the definition of sexual assault used in the survey. Quote, sexual assault occurs when a person is forced, coerced, or tricked into sexual acts against their will or without their consent, including when they have withdrawn their consent. So what does it mean to be tricked into a sexual act? Is that the same as seduced? Because we know how much women detest the art of seduction. Now again, 87% of students who were sexually assaulted in a university setting did not make a formal complaint. And when asked why, the most common answer was, I did not think it was serious enough. 40%, and 40% said they did not think they needed help. Now again, you can't add those two numbers together because you can choose multiple reasons. But if you exclude sexual assaults that students thought were not serious enough or they didn't need help with, you're down to less than 0.5% at an annual rate. And remember the self-selected nature of this survey. And nowhere in this report can you find a comparison to rates of sexual harassment and assault in the wider community. Bettina Arndt, in her piece in the Weekend Australian, produced statistics from the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics showing a total of 14 cases of sexual assault were reported to police over the 5-year period from 2012 to 2016 from universities. That's less than 3 reports per year spread over 11 universities, which means 75% of New South Wales universities report 0 cases of sexual assault in any 1 year. Far from being an epidemic, this should be considered good news. The data in this report demonstrates clearly that universities are not hotbeds of sexual harassment and sexual assault. This is not to say that sexual assault and harassment doesn't occur at universities or that more support services for genuine victims shouldn't be made available. But there is no epidemic and there is no need for hysteria. About the only journalist or commentator that got this right was Bettina Arndt.
Does 0.8% of reported assaults, sexual assaults at universities, strike you as a sign of a crisis?
No, it strikes me as a wonderful sign that even after these students have been bombarded with propaganda around this, I mean, we've talked, Andrew, before about this movie, The Hunting Ground, which was really a propaganda movie trying to beat up this idea that there was a rape culture on campus, and which has actually been denounced, for instance, by 19 Harvard law professors as misrepresenting key cases that were included in that movie. Now, that was shown across Australia, and yet our wonderful students told the truth and said, no, most of us have not been sexually assaulted. All most of us have been a few unpleasant stares, a sexual joke, some things that might have bothered us, but we're certainly not talking about what most of us would regard as rape.
And so we've had advocacy groups scurrying about producing bogus surveys, screening the discredited documentary The Hunting Ground all across university campuses for more than a year, aided and abetted by cheerleading journalists, and now with the backing of the Human Rights Commission that has used overly broad definitions to make the figures look as bad as possible in their survey. And what have we got? A report that suggests young adults at university are safer than they are in the general public at large, and that serious incidences of sexual assault at Australian universities are relatively rare occurrences. So, do you think the advocates may learn something from this data, or do you think they'll just plough ahead with the narrative? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.